Hello, and welcome to another episode of South Pole, the podcast that explores everything Antarctica. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are talking about the rights of nature, the rights of Antarctica, and how we're going to defend them. All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. Thank you for being here today. We have a very special guest today who is dedicated to protecting the future of Antarctica. Now, a lot of the people we talk to on the show are as well, but this guest is someone who is working to literally revolutionize the entire international legal framework to hold space for the rights of nature. But he is not alone. Before we speak to him, I should tell you about an organization called Antarctic Rights. Spoiler alert, our guest today is speaking on behalf of them and is going to talk to us about the work that they are doing. Now, Antarctic Rights is both an organization and a movement. It is a group of people with varying backgrounds, some legal experts, some scientists, some who have spent their lives in environmental advocacy, and they are working together to seek legal recognition for Antarctica within the international legal system as an entity with its own rights. This would also involve a body of representatives to advocate for Antarctica's best interest in international policy meetings. Now, it's a really interesting conversation we have, and in it, we discuss whether or not something like this has ever been done before. We talk about who they're seeking recognition from, and we have an interesting discussion about how to actually go about determining what is in the best interest of nature and also who should decide. And once those questions are all answered, how do we enforce them? Now, it's quite new territory, but it's very interesting and I think leading somewhere special and also somewhere we need to go. So to tell us all about this, who are we speaking to? Today we have with us Cormac Cullinan, who is an author and an environmental attorney. He is the director of Cullinan Associates, which is an environmental law firm based in Cape Town, South Africa, which listeners of the show will remember happens to be one of the big 5 gateway cities to Antarctica. Cullinan is also the founder and director of the Wild Law Institute, which advocates for the legal recognition of the rights of all nature as a basis for building ecologically sustainable and just societies. He is also the author of a book by the same title, Wild Law. I very much enjoyed getting to speak with Cormac about his career defending the rights of the environment and his endeavors with Antarctic Rights. Without further ado, let's get started. All right, we are recording. Well, first of all, welcome to the show. The first question I have is if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work.
Thank you, Clark, and thank you for inviting me to join this podcast. So I work as an environmental lawyer and a director of South Africa's oldest specialist environmental law firm, but I've also been involved for more than 20 years in the rights of nature movement. I wrote a book called Wild Law, which set out some of the theory of the rights of nature, and then was one of the founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. So, yes, in essence, I guess I'm partially a practicing attorney and partially an activist for rights of nature.
All right, thank you for being here. Now, let's just jump right in and unpack that. The rights of nature. What are the rights of nature?
So I became an environmental lawyer because I thought the way humans are behaving is causing a deterioration in our habitat, this planet, and that law is one of the most powerful ways of changing human behavior. So I thought that we could fix the problem with better environmental laws. And for a long time, I focused on that. And then I began to realize that some of the problems couldn't be solved with simply better drafting of laws, and there were deeper underlying problems. And one of the things that I realized was at the heart of it is this idea that we humans are somehow separate and superior to nature, instead of recognizing in reality that we are one life form among many and we are embedded in this community of life. And that mechanistic worldview is hardwired into our legal systems. So everything that is not a human being or a corporation or a state is defined by law as an object or as property. To give you an analogy, when we defined people as property, we called them slaves. So if you've got a slave owner with legal rights and a slave who's an object, property with no rights, it's very easy to see that the system is designed for the slave owner to exploit the slave. And we've adopted that same approach in relation to nature. So all of nature is defined as object, which is by definition incapable of having rights. It's simply, in the eyes of the law, resources for people to use. And that means that there's a real imbalance because we humans claim to have rights, human rights, by virtue of the fact that we exist. Even if your government doesn't recognize them, we say just because you exist as a human, you have those rights, they're inherent rights. But humans are just one leaf on the tree of life. So the idea that this leaf could have rights, whereas the whole tree doesn't have the right to exist, is absurd. So the only way we can really protect human rights is by recognizing the rights of other beings to exist and to continue playing their ecological roles. And once I saw that, I realized that we have to change the purpose of our legal systems. So instead of a legal system which is colonial in nature, in the sense that it justifies the exploitation of others, of other beings, our legal systems need to align with the laws of nature and help us to be good citizens, if you like, within this community of life. And I wrote about that theory of law. I called it Earth jurisprudence. Jurisprudence just meaning philosophy of law. And then the laws which implement it, I called wild laws. But it's really just about recognizing that if we humans want to flourish on this planet, we need to recognize that we're born into a pre-existing system of order, and we need to align our laws with that.
Okay, that's really fascinating. I'm wondering, when you say we need to reimagine our legal systems, our legal framework, would you say that we need to start from scratch, as it were, to fold in this idea to our legal systems? Or are there any examples of laws or frameworks already out there that do uphold this concept of Earth jurisprudence that we can perhaps look to as an example or build off from?
Yes, sure. Probably the most notable example is the constitution that was adopted by Ecuador in 2008. And what the Constitution makes quite clear is that it's designed to provide a framework for Ecuadorian society to live well in harmony with nature. And they say in order to live well in harmony with nature, you need to recognize that other beings are subjects, not objects, and that they have the rights to exist and play their roles. And that might be another species, it might be a river or a mountain, because, in a dry country like South Africa, where I come from, we can say in the Constitution you have the right to life, but it's meaningless unless you have water. And if you want to have water, you have to protect the river, the mountain, the clouds, the whole hydrological cycle. So it's perhaps most easily seen as one of the ways in which we can help people live well in harmony with nature.
Okay, I think that's quite a strong foundation for the rest of this conversation, because what we're going to be doing is to apply this philosophy to Antarctica. Now, you're affiliated with an organization called Antarctic Rights. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization and how and why you got involved?
Sure. A couple of years ago, somebody put the question to me, could you apply the rights of nature approach to help protect Antarctica? I think the question originally came from Carola Raqueta, who's a ship's captain and now a member of the European Parliament. And she was working at the time for an NGO in Tasmania. She heard of rights of nature and wondered if it could help. So when the question was put to me, I thought, well, of course you can. But then I started thinking about it, and I was quite shocked, actually, how little I knew about Antarctica and how important it is. And my role now is I'm part of a working group, Antarctic Rights working group that you mentioned, and my organization, the Wild Law Institute, functions as the secretariat of that working group. And we're in the process of pulling together organizations into an Antarctic Alliance, which will take this initiative further. But I think that Antarctica represents an extraordinary opportunity for teaching people the importance of this approach, because Antarctica is not only ecologically unique, it's also unique in terms of governance, because it's not owned by anybody. So countries came and stuck in their flags and claimed bits of it, but those claims were never finalized. An Antarctic Treaty system was set up. There's a group of countries which effectively make decisions about Antarctica. But what you can see very clearly is that because there are no people who are indigenous to Antarctica, Antarctica doesn't have a parliament or a government to advance its best interests. It's run by, if you like, this club of countries arguing from their own best interests. So Antarctica is not recognized as a subject, as essentially just a place or a territory under international law. And I immediately saw that if you could change that, if people could begin to see Antarctica not as a place, but as a community of beings, of a huge being itself. And particularly because this is an extraordinarily important area for the planet.
Yes, listeners of the show will be well aware after, however many episodes have come out at this point, the importance of Antarctica, both to climate systems and I guess human civilization. But when I asked you about an example of a framework that upholds this Earth jurisprudence, you mentioned the Ecuadorian Constitution, which is explicitly a national context governing the people who live within the borders of that nation state, right? Antarctica, as you mentioned, no one really lives there. That, alongside with the fact that it is governed by this treaty, begs for an international approach, I suppose. So on that front, I guess I have two questions. We still have yet to cover the Antarctic Treaty explicitly on the show. It will have its own episode, but it does get mentioned a lot. And I know the Antarctic Treaty does have some environmental protocols, which I guess are meant to be upheld. But I read on the website for the Antarctic Rights Organization that the treaty's environmental protocols are not, in fact, strong enough. So in what ways is the initiative of the Antarctic Rights Movement designed to fill the gaps in the treaty or to create a framework that is necessary to protect what is not already protected?
Sure. Part of this whole initiative is to get people to see Antarctica and by extension nature differently. So in other words, we're saying this is not just a place. Antarctica needs to be seen as a being in a community of beings. And as such, it should have a voice in human decision-making that affects it. In other words, human decision-making should make decisions about Antarctica on the basis of what's in the best interests of Antarctica. And that happens to also be in our interest because, as you know, if the Antarctic ice melts, we don't only lose a unique ecosystem, which is essential for the climate stability and the circulation of the ocean currents, but coastal cities disappear as sea levels rise, etc. So what we're pitching for is for Antarctica to be recognized as having a unique legal status, similar to that of a state, so that it can be represented in international affairs, so that it can have agency. Because at the moment, because it doesn't have a government, it doesn't have a seat at the United Nations, and surely it should. It can't send a delegation to climate change meetings and argue that climate change is having an adverse effect on it. And it can't be represented in courts around the world. And we want to change that.
Okay, I'm understanding. You want to give Antarctica a voice in international spaces, and you want it to be represented and its interests advocated for. And just for listeners who might not think, the United Nations, for example, is made up of nation states, how could a non-state entity have a voice? But in fact, actually lots of non-governmental voices are very present and very vocal at international UN-type meetings, be it treaty negotiations, conferences, etc. And these are sometimes corporate interests, sometimes they are interest groups or advocacy networks, and sometimes they're scientists, right? Now, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is a UN organization of scientists who put forth their research to be considered at climate discussions, for example. There's also now a treaty being negotiated on at the UN about plastics, and there's a scientist coalition for an effective plastics treaty. Pine Forest Media actually has an episode all about this treaty on Plastic Podcast that anyone can go listen to if they're interested in learning more about how science is informing those policy negotiations. But I'm just throwing this out there to say that no geographic territory outside of the nation states has a voice yet in these spaces. There is a precedent for entities beyond strictly national governments to take up space in these places. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of your draft proposal, which I read and is divided into 3 parts. We'll take them one by one. And the first is, as you mentioned, to recognize Antarctica as a legal entity. My first question is, who is this audience and who are we asking to make this recognition?
So I suppose ultimately we would like, all the countries of the world or the United Nations to recognize Antarctica as having this status. But I think the first step is to get the public and civil society on board and for them to appreciate and take on this new approach to Antarctica, to see Antarctica as indigenous peoples throughout the world see other beings, that we need to maintain respectful relationships with other beings if we are going to thrive in this community of life. I think the next step would then be to start working with countries and to seek support from countries who are most at risk if Antarctica essentially deteriorates and melts, and such as low-lying states, etc. But it's also important, for example, to realize that many states are not at all involved in the protection of Antarctica. There's only a small group of states who are part of the Antarctic Treaty system. For example, in Africa, only South Africa of all the African states is involved. So most of these countries perhaps didn't see Antarctica as really very important to them. But I think that's changed in the era of climate change, because we can now see that Antarctica is important to everybody on the planet. And that means I think that everybody should be involved in it. And perhaps just to digress briefly to answer what you asked before about the existing treaty system. So the existing treaty system, we think, can't really protect Antarctica. Look, the original Antarctic Treaty system was a brilliant achievement. It was negotiated and signed at the height of the Cold War, and it prevented Antarctica being mined, and it reserved it for peace and science, for peaceful purposes and science. So I'm not here to, as it were, diss the Antarctic Treaty System. But the factor is that it can't protect Antarctica for a number of reasons. First of all, it only applies to the treaty area, which is defined. But now we have a situation where the main threat to Antarctica, climate change, is coming from outside of the treaty area. So the treaty system can't address that. Secondly, there's only a small number of countries participating, as I've mentioned, and each of them are arguing on the basis of their national interests. So when they meet, they're thinking about what's best for our country, and there's nobody advancing the best interests of Antarctica, which we think is crucial. And perhaps most importantly, the existing system is entirely stuck. There's an impasse. That is in part because decision-making has to be by consensus. And for example, both Russia and the Ukraine are members, so you can imagine how hard it is to get consensus. But there are also countries like Russia who have for a long time been conducting seismic surveys to explore for oil and gas under Antarctica. And one can't help thinking that the only reason for that is that at some future date, they want to be able to exploit that. And of course, there's also cruel fishing and many other pressures on Antarctica, where countries are acting in ways which they perceive to be in their own national interests, but definitely not in the interests of Antarctica.
Okay, I think those examples really just show how the existing treaty is designed for countries to advocate for their own interests in Antarctica rather than for the interest of Antarctica itself, right? And there's an overlap sometimes with the climate change being an example, but nevertheless, they are very different approaches.
We think that just at the moment where we realize that Antarctica is absolutely crucial to the health of the planet and the future of humanity as well as other species, we have a governance system which really isn't fit for purpose. And it's very unlikely that change can come from within the system. So what we're doing is to set up a very powerful new idea and a magnet for change. If I can use an analogy, after the Second World War, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, it was actually a non-binding document, and it didn't change any of the laws in the world immediately, but it set up such a powerful idea of norm of acceptable human behavior that ultimately legal systems all over the world changed in response to that. And that's what we're hoping, is that this will set off a process of change which will completely alter not only the existing treaty system, but also how countries around the world relate to Antarctica. And as I mentioned, how Antarctica features in international negotiations.
I really like that idea that this could sort of serve as a cascading effect, and the countries around the world could adopt it and apply it to their own, non-human geographic entities in their own countries, and would just sort of be a precedent, right? And I'm wondering, though, would this in fact be the first precedent of something like this? Because I know, at least in the United States, businesses, for example, have rights, protected rights, as though they were human beings. But are there any examples that we have of natural elements having rights like this, or would this in fact be the first?
There are examples of aspects of nature having rights, but so far it's only been at the national level, in other words, within a country. So, for example, I mentioned Ecuador, also in New Zealand, the Whanganui River and a national park have both been recognized as legal entities with rights. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court has recognized the Atrato River and others as rights. In Europe, a lagoon, the Mar Menor, was recognized last year as a legal subject with rights. So you do have these examples in an increasing number of countries around the world, but not really at the international level. In other words, this would be the first time we would be saying that within international law must develop to accommodate the idea that the subjects of international law are not just states and international organizations, but also these natural beings, if I could call them that, such as Antarctica. So it is currently unprecedented at the international law level.
Okay, then it seems like Antarctica might just be the perfect candidate to be the first one because everyone and no one has claimed it, I guess, if that makes sense. The second objective in the draft proposal, once this recognition is established, is to actually set up a body to represent the interests of Antarctica in these spaces. So can you tell me first a bit about how you imagine the logistics of that will go, and also if you can speak to how this body would go about determining what, in fact, are the best interests of Antarctica?
We have a draft declaration of the rights of Antarctica, which is on the website, and people can go and look at it. And the idea is that once we are recruiting organizations to be founder members of this Antarctic Alliance, and once we've launched that, hopefully either later this year or early next year, those members will engage in discussions to refine that declaration and come up with a final version that can be adopted. But that is just, if you like, a statement of what we see as the rights of Antarctica, for example, to be represented in international affairs, to exist, to play its ecological role, et cetera, et cetera. But the question then becomes implementation. And we started working on a separate document about how one could make this real and how Antarctica could actually be represented. And then we decided that we would hold that back until we've got the Antarctic Alliance, and then the members of that alliance would discuss it. But in broad terms, I mean, the issue is that we're probably going to need something like a parliament for Antarctica. But obviously there aren't human constituencies, so you can't have members of parliament in the ordinary sense, but you might have people who represent either a particular ecosystem within Antarctica or perhaps a particular aspect like ice or seals or krill or whatever. But the real fundamental question is, how do we hear what's in the best interests of Antarctica, and who are the right people to do that? So, and I think this is really exciting. We'll have to be innovative and we'll have to experiment and we'll get better at it over time. But I would say the people who are going to determine that need to be people who know a lot about Antarctica, who understand it, not just people who are intellectually interested in Antarctica or knowledgeable, but also people who have, if I can call it, a heart connection with Antarctica. In other words, people who love Antarctica, because, if you think of other instances where one is representing a being who can't speak, let's say a baby, the people you want to represent the baby's best interests are the parents who love it because they're most attentive to it, they've got its best interests at heart, and they're most likely to articulate accurately what its best interests are. And essentially, there's also really exciting research being done, for example, on using artificial intelligence to try and interpret what whales are saying. We're getting more and more able to hear, if you like, nature. And I think all of that is going to feed into this. And over time, we will get better at determining what's in the best interest of Antarctica and the beings that live in Antarctica, the seals, the whales, etc.
What do you want, whales? I got you. But I guess if you have a lot of knowledge about a topic like this, experts would be in the best position to make decisions like this.
It's probable, I think, that we can never, as human beings, be in a position to say absolutely this is the best in the interests of Antarctica and define it in a kind of absolute sense. But what I do think is that if we use our science and we use our hearts as well as our minds, when we are faced with two options, option A or option B, we probably are able to say option B is more in the best interests of Antarctica than option A. And that's all you need really in international decision-making, to be able to have that discernment. But I think that the process of trying to work out how one listens to nature and articulates the best interests of an aspect of nature in human decision-making is a really fascinating endeavor, and it's just exactly the kind of things humans need to be looking at and innovating about in this period, not only for Antarctica, but for our relationships with this magnificent planet as a whole.
Well, I would love to be the person in charge of speaking for the whales, but alas, I would be horrendously underqualified. But I think this gets to a really philosophical question at heart, right? What are the best interests of a natural entity? Because you could say the best interests for Antarctica are that which sustains climate systems that best suit humans, perhaps. You could also say that it's what's best for the penguins. What I'm getting at is, like, when the climate changes, the climate changes. It's not as though the world implodes. The world will just continue, and then whatever species are best fit to the new conditions will thrive, right? The world has changed and frozen and melted several times over, and it just keeps turning around the sun. But In any case, I like what you said about the people speaking for it should be the ones who have that heart's connection. I think I've spoken to a number of those kinds of people on this podcast, and I hope to continue speaking to more. But yeah, I'll be interested to see how this all unfolds. Then I guess once this body is hopefully put together, the third objective in the draft declaration is to implement stronger protections for the continent. In terms of specific policies, that might be a question for these scientists. But in terms of the framework for upholding them, once we have these policies and these decisions made about what is in the best interest of Antarctica, would we be relying on existing mechanisms of enforcement, or would we need to create more?
That's an extremely good question. At one level, if one's talking ecologically, I guess that Antarctica is already self-governing and nature is self-enforcing. By that, I mean is that it's far too wild a place for humans to think that they can actually govern it. What happens in Antarctica is determined by natural processes. But the question you ask is really important in relation to human conduct, because Antarctica wouldn't be a state in the normal sense. It wouldn't have a navy and a defense force, etc. So we do have to rely on human institutions to regulate human behavior within Antarctica. And to a large extent, the states are currently responsible for the behavior of their citizens when they go into Antarctica. But I think that this is something where the existing Antarctic Treaty system might well continue to play a very important role in enforcing the rules, if you like, enforcing how humans must behave in relation to Antarctica. And I think that there may also be new enforcement mechanisms developed over time. But I think that the real thing is the mind shift and the paradigm shift. And quite frankly, I think that the scientists who are already engaged in Antarctic research would find it very stimulating to work together, to collaborate in working out what's best for Antarctica, how best to listen to Antarctica, if I can put it that way. A bit like the IPCC you mentioned in relation to climate change, where everybody's putting their data together around common objectives. Some of the people within the Antarctic Treaty system have been a little bit suspicious, thinking that we're attacking the system. That's not our objective. Our objective is to improve the system. But others within the Antarctic Treaty system are incredibly excited because they've spent their life working on protecting Antarctica. They've produced the scientific evidence, for example, which proves that you should have a marine protected area in a particular place, and then they just get blocked and nothing happens. And it happens year after year, and they have this appreciation of the extreme urgency of addressing this situation, and at the same time, institutional inertia. Many of them are really excited about this idea because it has the potential to break the logjam. And I think that's absolutely essential, because I don't think you can solve these problems within the thinking or the mindset that created them.
Now that we have an understanding of what the objectives of this organization are, I want to ask you, where are we in the process of working towards them? What step are we on now? What's the next step? What challenges are you currently facing? How are we doing?
Yes, that's really important, because we started with the idea that there was this group of us, many people involved in Antarctica, ranging from scientists to philosophers to people interested in photography and art and culture around Antarctica, and then rights of nature, people like myself. We thought that we would work together. It's a very international group, people from around the world. We'd come up with a declaration and adopt it. That would be our manifesto, and we would go forward. And we realized that this is a really big project. It's something that, if successful, is going to really change the international legal order and hopefully also have knock-on effects for countries. It's going to take time. It's a long-term project. It's a game-changing project. And we needed a stronger vehicle to carry this forward into the future. So we decided to first build an Antarctic Alliance, we're calling it. So at the moment, we are recruiting organizations, and individuals can also join, but we really want to have a solid basis of organizations from around the world that will commit to collaborating to make this happen. So we're in that phase. Once we've got that Antarctic Alliance together towards the end of this year or early next year, we would launch it, and then the founder members would engage in the process of finalizing the declaration. Then once we have got the declaration finalized, we would adopt the declaration, ideally sometime around about November, December 2025, when the climate change COP is happening in Brazil. And then once we've got that, that's our manifesto. And then we would be engaging in the discussions that I've mentioned already about how do you make this, how do you implement this? But while all of this is going on, we really want to be building public support for this, because it really will only happen if enough people around the world, individuals and organizations, say that we need to have this, and we're going to push our governments to recognize it and adopt it.
Yeah, and I hope the awareness that comes about through this campaign throughout the general public also kind of accelerates the process, because I think we have a little bit of a general problem of people not exactly being aware of how important Antarctica is to the future, or perhaps the negative consequences of failing to protect it. But I think once people are aware, there's going to be more urgency than ever. But on the topic of broad-based public buy-in, let me ask you a couple questions. The first is, where can people learn more about this initiative? And then what can the average person do to support it?
Thank you. That's really important. We'd like all listeners to go to the website. We've got a beautiful website, antarcticrights.org. If you go to the website, there's a join us button. You can join either as an individual or as an organization. That will really keep you linked into the process. And obviously, particularly with organizations, we'll start a process where everybody can comment on the draft declaration and make these submissions and play a part in shaping that.
All right, after this phone call, I will go straight to the website and I'll hit that join us button, and I'll put a link in the episode description so anyone listening to the podcast can also do that. And I guess this is the part where I ask you, I mean, I'm sure we could go on talking about this for a long time, but is there anything that we didn't touch on today that we would be kicking ourselves if we didn't mention before we finish out this conversation?
I would just say that, I'm a person that has been involved in environmental issues, environmental law for most of my life. And I was completely amazed when I started looking at this to discover how little I knew about Antarctica, partially because I think the Antarctic Treaty system meetings are held in private and the press aren't allowed in it, et cetera. And so there's a sort of air of secrecy. But I was just staggered to discover first how huge it is. I mean, the land mass is bigger than the United States and Mexico together. Then if you add the Southern Ocean, as I mentioned, it's 10% of the surface of the planet. And it drives the ocean circulation. It's incredibly ecologically important, as your listeners will know. It's very hard to overstate the importance of it. And I was slightly shocked by how this hadn't really been on my radar before. But it's been a very exciting initiative. All I can say to people is that I think if you get involved in this and you also see yourself as somebody who can go out and change people around you, make them aware of Antarctica and what can be done, that you could come in at the ground floor of a really exciting movement that I believe is going to be historical. It's going to change the international order, and it's going to do something really, really good for this amazing community of life we call Earth.
All right. Well, with that, this is the part where I say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing this initiative with us. And also thank you so much for your work in this space and your entire career, I guess, that you dedicated to advocating for the environment.
Thank you very much, Clark. It's been a privilege to be on this show. And I really hope that lots of your listeners will throw their weight behind this initiative.
All right, a major thank you to Cormac Cullinan. And just a quick mention that anyone interested in learning more about the Antarctic Rights or getting involved even can find out how to do that in the episode description. All right, thanks for listening. You've been listening to South Pole. You can find more information about this week's guests and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laura Wong, and the music you're listening to is done by Neela Ruiz. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced and engineered by me. So if you found it interesting, send it to someone you know. South Pole is part of a larger network of science-y podcasts called Pine Forest Media. We've got one on plastic, one on drinking water, and a couple new ones coming out soon. You can find more information about us in the episode description as well, or on our website at pineforestpods.com. We're also on Instagram and TikTok at Pine Forest Media. And if you love the show and you want to support science communication like this, a 5-star rating across platforms or a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help us reach more people and for the entire network to grow. All right, thank you so much to all of you who have made it this far, and we'll talk soon.